It's great to see everyone. I'm glad that I know that a lot of things go around and people are sick, and this one texts me, I can't come, this is sick, this one's sick. So Baruch Hashem, at least all of you are here, those of you in the room. Great to see everyone on Zoom who couldn't come. Thank you for being with us. Today's shiur we are dedicating to the Lilui Nishmat Nikki's father, Tzvi Ben Yisrael Kantor Zichrono Livracha. It should be an aliyah for neshama, very special person who my family knew, my grandparents knew very well, and his memory should be for a blessing. Okay, I want to Hanukkah. No, I haven't mentioned about Hanukkah.
Good morning, everyone. How was the tiyul? Those of you that were on the tiyul, it was amazing. So we have the next tiyul planned on. You can register in the office. I just want to say that Hanukkah, we will not have classes, but on the first day of Hanukkah, everyone's invited on Monday for a Hanukkah seminar in English and in Hebrew, and we're going to have Hallel, musical Hallel, 8:30 in the morning. I wrote a festive breakfast. I don't know what I promised, but there'll be nice napkins there. Sultaniyot, of course. It'll be decorative. We'll see. But we'd love to see all of you here. Okay, so Hanukkah Sameach, and welcome.
Okay, thanks, Oshra. So we're going to jump straight back into where we were. We were looking, if you remember, we spoke about this idea. As I said to you last time, when I went into my first philosophy class in university, I didn't understand a word of political philosophy. I hope at least last class we got a little bit more than I got from my first class. But we were speaking about this idea of the social contract. And we said that generally as social contract philosophers ask the question, what or how can we create a society? What is it about society? How can we bring individuals or self-interested individuals together and form some kind of societal communal contract that will bind people together so that they put on themselves certain limitations, certain boundaries for the good of the whole and for the good of themselves. And we looked at Hobbes, the Leviathan. We spoke about the social contract theorists. And we said that generally speaking, the social contract theorists speak about the idea of a contract or a compact, as they like to call it. And that is really whereby you give up some of your rights in order to gain some liberties. But you give up some liberties in order to gain some rights, opposite way around. But by doing so, you're doing it really, a contract is really what the point of a contract is that you commit to doing some things, and the power, right, or the governing body or whatever you want to call it, commits to giving you certain protections, certain rights, etc., etc. But then we said that dafka in the Torah, there is a different concept, and that is the concept of covenant. And we dafka spoke about the fact that covenant and covenantal thinking, we brought in Daniel Elazar, we looked at Daniel Elazar, who speaks about the idea that dafka in Europe, we really have the social contract theorists, but in America, the American Constitution and various other things, the founding fathers were deeply influenced by the idea of covenant. And covenant is more than a contract. Covenant is also about a certain sense of trust, a certain sense of loyalty. It's about the idea that you're part of something bigger than yourself, and you're committing to be part of something bigger than oneself. And it's where the individual, it's really speaking about the individual that doesn't just see themselves as an individual with their own self-interest, right? Or survival of themselves, but the individual that sees outside of themselves. That's what covenantal politics is about. It's not just about the fact that I want all my rights, and I realize that pragmatically, if I give up something, I'll get something in return. That's not. Covenantal politics is much more than that. And we looked at what Rabbi Sachs spoke about. We looked at Daniel Elazar, where they talk about the individual that sees the other, the individual that sees outside of themselves. That's part of covenant. Today, I want to bring Ephraim Meir. Professor Ephraim Meir, in source number 15, was a professor of mine in Bar Ilan University. He was the head of Machshavet Yisrael, Machleket Machshavet Yisrael for quite a few years. He's really an incredible human being. He's actually a convert to Judaism. He was, I think, a Christian, definitely a very Christian pastor, maybe even. He was a very practicing devout. That's what I'm looking for. Thank you. A very devout Christian. And him and his wife converted to Judaism many, many, many years ago. He lives in Yerushalayim, and he was also a student of Levinas. He was a student of Emmanuel Levinas. He translated Levinas's books into Hebrew. He always says he's one of the most humble people you're ever going to meet. He really is an incredible human being. When you meet him, he has like something about him I can't explain. Like I always call it Etzelem Elokim. He's really an amazing human being. And he always says, I made Levinas more Levinas than Levinas. What does he mean by that? Because Levinas, when you translate Levinas is all about the inner and the outer and the face-to-face encounter. And he says the Hebrew language is born to be Levinasian, because even if you think about the words panim, the panim, face and internal, or he played with the Hebrew language when he translated Levinas to make it work in a very Levinasian way. Did you want to add something? Yeah, sure.
Just not to add, but I'm just curious, where does a neder fit in with this?
In what sense? You need to expand your question for me to understand. The question was, where does it, for those on Zoom, where does a neder fit in with this?
We've got a compact. Now, if you make a neder, where does that?
Okay, so I think an oath is something slightly funny enough. Just I'm doing 929, and we were talking about Yiftach in Shoftim, his oath that his vow that he made that whoever came out, if he beat in the army and war, whoever came out, he would sacrifice, and his daughter comes out, and he sacrifices his daughter. So it's just richly fresh in my head, this idea of the oath. A vow is something quite different. I don't want to get into a vow. A vow is
it's personal.
It's not as black and white, meaning there is this idea of a marriage contract is also a vow. It's a sense of loyalty, but vows can also be broken. There's a lot to say about vows, especially in Judaism, because, for example, kol nidrei, right? Neder. Why on Erev Yom Kippur is the one thing we enter Yom Kippur by annulling our vows. So there's a lot to say there. I don't think it's 100% connected to the idea of covenant. I think there is an element there, meaning I commit myself to something. I commit myself to entering into a covenant. It could be done via a vow, but I think a vow is already a whole nother level. And I don't want to get into it now, okay, because it's not 100% related. To go back to Ephraim Meir, what he speaks about, a lot of his books are speaking, he only has one, I mean, maybe he's got two books that translate into English. The book Dialogical Thought and Identity, and there he speaks very much about the idea. His entire philosophy is based on the idea of Levinas's dialogical encounter. Levinas was a dialogical philosopher, which means that he believes that the source of ethics and morality comes from the encounter between two people. When I have the face-to-face encounter with another person, that draws me to conclude, or that draws out a mandate, an imperative for me to act morally towards another person. I'm not going to get into why that's important and why the dialogical philosophers come on the heels of modernity. There's a lot to say there. I'm not going to get into it today. What I want to read with you is how he understands the idea of constructing identity. And why did I bring you this source? Because if, again, to go back to Sefer Bamidbar, if we think about the Jewish people are literally, we spoke about the idea of the wilderness of the Midbar being that in-between space. And really on many, many different levels. It's the space where they are moving from individual identity to national identity. It's the space in which they're moving from almost no identity, from slaves who really have no identity, to having an identity. And then once they gain that identity, there's also that tension between the individual and the national. Where do I stand? Remember, we spoke at the beginning that they're counted to be part of an army. That's a national identity. That's a national mission. That's a group mission. But Moshe says, lift up their heads. He also understands, or God understands, that each human being needs to have their own individual identity. And the question is, how do I form my identity? Now, we live in an age in which personal identity is very important. In fact, I would say it's one of the dominating themes. Some people, everyone's speaking about what do I identify as? Who am I? What's my identity? And the irony is that we're sitting in an age whereby, on the one hand, everyone wants to be able to define their own identity by their own categories. And at the same time, people want to say, don't identify me. Non-gender, don't identify me. So we're actually, it's almost an oxymoron. The age, and that really defines our culture, right? It's almost an oxymoron whereby on the one hand, it's so important to us that I'm identified the way I want to be identified. And at the same time, I actually am eschewing all identities. I don't want you to identify me at all. I want to break down all the boxes. That's classic radical postmodernism. But the one thing that this culture, I think, is definitely saying is, I identify the way I decide, not what I've been born into. My identity is not dependent on my cultural or my conditional existence. What Judaism says is that, yes, it is. You're born a Jew, you're a Jew. Whether you like it or not, and you can try to do everything you want to do to escape, you're born a Jew. There are many things we can decide. And that was the absolute revolutionary idea of the Bible, that we are free individuals. It was so revolutionary in the ancient age, because in the ancient age, they believed in fate. And Judaism came and said, no, we believe in destiny. We believe we're free. We believe at any given moment we can do tshuva, we can change who we are, we can change our past, present, and future. But there are things that we cannot change. And that is what we're born into. That is certain basic foundations of things that you have boundaries that exist in order to give you that foundation. That's why we said that Sefer Bamidbar, that very moment, the moment in which we gain our individual identity and our national identity, we see how important those foundations are. Why is it that a sotah has to be put outside boundaries? Because she threatens the very fabric of our foundational society, which is marriage. Why is a Nazir someone who's allowed to remain in within certain things? Because he wants to self-express, same language we hear today in postmodern terminology. He wants to self-express, but we say to him, you can self-express, but you have to do so within certain limitations because you belong in a social context. We are all social animals. Again, this sits very much in this political idea that we've been building up. How do we create a society from self-interested, if we believe people to be self-interested individuals? And we've gone through many different things. Now I want to look at Ephraim Meir, because what he argues is that actually our identity is formed not through our own self-definitions, but instead through our relationship with the other. Ultimately, we define ourselves through our relationship with the other. Now, that's not to say we don't have our own identity. On the contrary, we have to have our own identity. It's just to say that we very, very often relate to ourselves through their, if we think about a child grows up in a social context. A child defines himself through his mother, through his parents, through his siblings, through who he is. The notion of self is born in connection. The notion of who I am begins in the way I relate to somebody else. And before we even read Ephraim Meir, I have to tell you that everything always interrelates for me. And in our reading group on Thursdays, we just began Rabbi Sachs' book, Radical Then, Radical Now. And again, I think you see mine is a very, very old copy that's falling apart, but I can't give it up because it's got a dedication from Rabbi Sachs himself. So I don't know if I have to get it rebound or whatever. But anyway, in the book, and by the way, if anyone's looking to begin Rabbi Sachs, not Covenant Conversation, but to begin any of his philosophy books, this is the book I always recommend to begin with. It's very thin, it's very easy reading, and yet it has, in my mind, it has the foundations of all of his thinking. In this book, and it just happened to be that last night I was reading through it, and I read something that connected exactly to what I wanted to say today, but exactly word for word. So I said, you know what, I don't have the source to give you. I didn't have enough time to come photocopy and whatever. I can do it. If people want, I can bring it for next week, but I have to read for you what he writes. He says like this, it was just so exactly what we were talking about. He says like this, no, this is not it. I put myself a marker, and then now I've lost the marker. 1 minute. I know exactly where it is. Just give me 1 second to find it. 1 second to find it. Yeah. Yes, the American version was the same book. Letters in the Scroll is the same as Radical Then, Radical Now. In America, they I don't know why. In America, they published it as Letters in the Scroll, and in England, they published it as Radical Then, Radical Now. No, I don't believe that. I've lost it. 1 minute. Just give me 2 seconds. I put down the page, and now I've gone and lost it. Don't believe it.
Right, also the English. Yeah, I just wrote down the English.
Okay. No. I thought I found it, but I haven't. Wait, give me 1 second.
We're giving you.
Covenantal, that's what it was. It was covenantal morality. I got the wrong chapter, that's why. Now I've got it. Okay. So I knew it was page 80, and then I was like, no, it doesn't. Okay. On this book, it's page 80, 81. Listen to what he says. He talks about it's in the chapter called, and this is even more telling, it's in the chapter called covenantal morality. And he speaks about the idea that morality is based on the idea of covenant. And he says, that he gives the example of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, where you have Adam and Chava at the beginning created more generically and universally in the names of Adam and Chava. But then in chapter 2, Adam, at the end of the whole narrative, calls his wife Ish. And he says, Ki lukocha mi ki ish. He defines her Isha because Ki lukocha mi ish, from himself. He defines himself after he defines her. And listen to what Rabbi Sachs says. He says, no sooner has the first man discovered the first woman, then a problem arises. In essence, the problem of, I'm going to read slowly because you don't have it, of all human association. The Bible puts this neatly and bluntly. Woman is ezer kenegdo, standardly translated as a suitable helper. The translation misses the point. Ezer means she is a help. Kenegdo means she is over and against him. She is not only a help, but also a potential adversary. And this is what we were talking about when we were talking about Hobbes' state of nature. She is not only a help, she is a separate self, a person, an equal, not subordinate to the male. Adam soon discovers that his wife has a will of her own. And then he goes, she eats from the fruit, etc., etc. Okay? What is rarely noticed is that it is just at this point, as they are leaving the garden, that Adam confers on his wife a proper name. No longer just the woman, right? He calls her Chava. He calls her Chava because she is the mother of all life. For the first time, he recognizes her as an independent personality. At that point, God does a rather moving thing. No longer angry, he makes clothes for them both. Once Adam has recognized Eve as an equal but opposite, without whom he cannot beget life, God blesses their union. Something fundamental is happening here. The answer to the key question of social life. How can there be a stable relationship between two free individuals? How can one person's freedom respect that of another while endowing the bond between them with permanence so that it becomes the basis of trust? To this, the Bible gives an astonishing answer. It gives an answer astonishing in its originality and vast in its implications. Relationships lie not in power, but in the bonds of mutuality made possible by language. A relationship that depends on dominance, physical, economic, or political, is not one between free agents. If I've got power over you, it means it's at the expense of your freedom, okay? It also, I want to continue just the next paragraph. One second. The entire complex achievement of civilization depends on groups of individuals working together. I must be able to depend on others and they on me. But if this is not to be brought about by one of us having power over the other, then it depends on trust. And trust depends on my giving my word and keeping it. Just as God creates the natural world with words, we create social world with words, sacred words, meaning, words that bind, and that connects to the idea of neder as well. This is the first intimation of an idea on which eventually all Jewish history will turn, the idea of covenant Brit. And one of my thesis of Rabbi Sachs, which I just recorded the podcast, which I sent out on my WhatsApp group if people got it, where I speak about this idea. I think one of the central ideas of Rabbi Sachs is the idea of Brit. There's been other covenantal writers before him, but I think he uses it in a way that no other Jewish theologian has used until Rabbi Sachs. And here he says it explicitly. Everything is centered on the idea of covenant. Listen to how he defines it. A covenant is made when free agents respecting one another's freedom bind themselves by a mutual promise to work together, but not just to work together, to be loyal to one another and to achieve together what neither can achieve alone. Keeping such a promise is called faithfulness, emunah, sometimes wrongly translated as faith. Emunah is not faith. It doesn't mean I believe in God. Emunah is faithfulness, and there's a very big difference. Faithfulness means I have trust. Faithfulness means loyalty. It doesn't necessarily mean blind belief. That's not what it means, or blind faith. The paradigm of such a relationship is marriage, which brings together in a single institution humanity's most basic drives and concerns: sex, affection, friendship, love, partnership, bringing new life into the world and caring for it and for one another. Marriage is where morality begins, because it is the supreme example of the bond of trust on which all social relationships depend. And he goes on and continues speaking about it, but we're not going to read the whole thing, okay? But essentially his idea is, those in my reader group on Thursday, you have to read the whole thing. But the point is, right, it depends on, the whole idea of covenant is the idea of emunah, which is the idea of faithfulness, and that you don't find in contract. Contract is not about trust. Contract is about clauses that if you break, the contract's over. Emunah is way above that. Emunah is where marriage is. It's the basis, the fabric of all social conditions. And it's also the way I identify myself. What he is saying here is that the idea of Ezer Kenegdo is, on the one hand, there is a need for people to come together. But on the other hand, there's also a need for people to recognize the individuality of each person within that social relationship, that recognize they are different, they are separate, and we have to respect their difference, their differentness, okay? And this is what Ephraim Meir speaks about.
Yeah, I was just struck, he focuses so much on language, and then obviously further along in the Parsha, or the next Parsha, with Bavel, with Migdal Bavel.
Yeah.
Now there you see sort of a bastardization of language, that here, they start with some sort of sense of communal purpose. They end up subsuming the individuals of the community, and God punishes them with language.
100%, because language is the key in Rabbi Sachs's work, in all his works. By the way, also, he's got a very, very important chapter in the end of Crisis and Covenant, which is out of print, but those who do have it. At the end of Crisis and Covenant, chapter 9, there's a chapter called The Tower of Babel. In his book, Dignity of Difference, the entire book begins and is based on the narrative of the Tower of Babel, because for him, language is, why is language so important? Because there's two kinds of language. There's a universal language, and then there's a particular language. We need to be able to communicate with everybody, and we use it, that there are certain ways of doing that universally. But what makes us unique and different is the fact that we are born exactly this idea. We are born into a specific language, I'm using metaphorically even, language and literally, language, culture, social network that makes us different. By the way, this is going to go it's exactly what I plan to do today, because I wanted to bring in Hanukkah, but I may as well just talk about it for 1 second now. I'll develop it slightly later, a bit more. But if we think about this idea of the boundaries, we spoke about that the whole beginning of Sefer Bamidbar are themes of inside and outside, right? We have the Sotah, and we have the Nazir, and then we have Pesach Sheni, those that can't, and then we have the Tumah and the Tahara. Who's inside the camp, who's outside the camp? If we think about the idea of, in fact, if we think about the idea of what creates our particular nation, our particular identity, we have to have certain boundaries, right? We have to be able to say what is inside and what is outside. And the greatest threat to Judaism came in times of the Greeks, which was Hanukkah, and the times of modernity, which was Enlightenment. Okay, by the way, both of which talk about this idea of light, of being enlightened and light, and Hanukkah is all about light. And I'll explain to you what the idea is. Both the Greeks and the Enlightenment periods wanted to universalize. They were both the Tower of Babel projects, both of them, because they believed that everything could be explained in a way that we can all understand it. Exactly like the Tower of Babel. And if you can't understand it, then you're stupid, or you're an ignoramus, or you deserve to be killed, or whatever it happens to be, okay? What Judaism says is the total opposite. It says there is a universal language of certain things that we have to work together. Ezel, right? We have to add in one, we have to be able to have a work community, work together, and certain things we can all do together. But our particular identity can only be understood from the inside. You go explain to someone about Shabbat. Try. You'll explain and it will sound lovely and whatever, but until you experience it, try and explain halakha, try and explain halachic lifestyle, try and explain what it is to be a Jew, what it is to live inside that particular experience and community. You can only really explain it from the inside. That is the beauty of particular language. That is the beauty of particular culture. Try and explain something from the outside, it's very, very difficult. What the Greeks wanted to do and the Enlightenment wanted to do was to explain everything. Why, by the way, in Hanukkah, all the themes of inside and outside are there the whole time. Do we light the candles inside the house, outside this house? Ultimately, on the Petach HaDelet, what's the Petach HaDelet? It's the boundary between the inside and the outside. It's there all the time because the entire story of the Greeks and the entire story of Hanukkah is a story about what we let in and what we don't, what we take from the outside culture and what we don't, what we translate and what can't be translated. And that is exactly the idea here of what Rabbi Sachs is speaking about in terms of language. And that's why the Tower of Babel, when we try to translate everything and everyone to be the same, the language to speak to every single person, it's impossible. Why? Because by our very nature, we are all different. By our very nature, we are diverse. And if we cannot translate it, we have to then coerce people to all be the same. And that was the Tower of Babel. So all the time language is at play. The antidote to the Tower of Babel is to scatter the people and to change their languages, because that's ultimately the role of human beings, to create cultural particular communities. I'm going to read Ephraim because he says it so beautifully. Listen to what he says. He says, I am different from others. 15. But when constructing my identity, that identity is also built by others. From the very first sentence, he's already telling us what we've been saying. That individual identity is built from a matrix of two almost opposing principles. One is that I'm the same as others, and there's things I have in common in language, we can speak together, and that I need others to construct my identity. But the other principle is I'm very, very different to others. So how do we manage that tension? That identity is primarily located in the foreignness of the self or to itself, or in the positive alienation from oneself in contact with the other. In the growing globalization of our societies, in which differences are gradually effaced, I think the question of individualization is a burning one. Ephraim Meir, in very academic language here, he is essentially saying we live in a world of globalization. And what is the aim of globalization? That we can all speak the same language, that we can all have a million different things in common, that we can break down all the boundaries, anything that defines me is different, so that we can all come together in a globalized community. What Ephraim Meir says here is that's a Tower of Babel ideal. But in reality, it can't even possibly happen. Why? Because we are all individuals. We are all people who speak different languages. In the ethical experience as openness to the non-I, to the person who isn't who I am, the life of the I comes to accomplishment in what Martin Buber calls the in-betweenness, or in what Franz Rosenzweig defines as a permanent translation. So all of these philosophers, Buber, Rosenzweig, Levinas, they were all grappling with the idea of how we form identity. And what they were all saying is that there is this in-between space, which immediately when I read this, what did it remind me of? The Bamidbar, exactly. Straight away, it reminded me of the Bamidbar, of this in-between space where identity is formed. And that in-between space is the space where I oscillate between being totally different and feeling different because I am I, and at the same time knowing that that my identity is formed in my interaction with others, that I identify myself through my interaction with others, through translation. The notions of in-betweenness and translation imply that at least two entities are at stake, entities that are completely separated and nevertheless interconnected. The connectedness with the other in a self that makes itself unique constitutes one's highest identity. This unique connectedness cannot be approached in a purely reflective way. It asks for a kind of thought that Franz Fischer has defined as proflective. In proflection, one thinks not out of the closed self, but rather through the act of tending to the other. In my concept of the self, I modify Levinas's other-centered position, in which the self is constituted by the other. What Ephraim Meir is saying here is he's basing his philosophy on Levinas, but he takes it one step further, because although Levinas says all identity is formed in our connection with the other, Ephraim Meir says not all our identity is formed in our connection with the other, because there are some places in which we cannot ever translate our individual experience. And I would say the same on a national level. There was a lot of debate in the 1960s and 70s about interfaith dialogue, especially in America. You had people like Heschel who were going out and trying to interact with the Christians and really, really believed in this idea of interfaith as breaking down the boundaries between the Christians and the Jews. And you had Rav Soloveitchik, especially in his essay Confrontation, that essentially said there are very few meeting points in which we can discuss anything with the Christians, because we are totally particular in our experience of religion, and there's nothing that can be translated universally. And people like Heschel, Yitz Greenberg, and other people were saying, no, there are many, many points in which we can find mutual language in which to talk about it. What is the basic, and it's interesting because Ephraim Meir is very, very engaged in interfaith. But his definition of, I actually wrote an academic essay on that. If this is anyone's interested, I compared and contrast Ephraim Meir, Soloveitchik, and Yitz Greenberg and their interfaith projects. If anyone's fancies reading it, then with pleasure I can send it to you. It's actually in a book. Just send me an email, I'll send it to you. But what I did was to show that while Soloveitchik totally negates any interfaith, because we're so particular, there's nothing we can translate to the outside world. So he says interfaith is not allowed. Interfaith engagement is not allowed on the faith level. It can be practical, but not on the faith level. Yitz Greenberg says, absolutely, we can translate, we can definitely engage in interfaith, but Ephraim Meir, he says what I'm trying to say here, which is maybe the way we engage with the other is to recognize that we are both totally different. Radical difference, but yet to know that ultimately we're all human beings and we understand that each of us is different. We understand the difference between us. And I think, to me, that is the basis of how we form identity. Identity is formed through our interaction. Like Adam says, she calls her Chava, right? He understands that she is Chava, because it names her that way, because he understands that she is different to him, and yet there are points in which they can meet. There are points in which they can build and create and build a family together. And he only identifies himself through her. Okay? A child identifies the child through the parent. That's how self-development happens. That's how self-identity is formed. as we grow older, we recognize that we don't have to identify ourselves only through our parent. We can identify ourselves. I'm watching with my daughter, Anne with an E. I don't know if anyone, Anne of Green Gables. It's the most amazing series. Absolutely love it. And we got, and actually, well, it doesn't matter. You all know. We got to the point in it where she's already quite a bit older. I think she's 16, and she's beginning to understand that she wants to know her roots, who her parents were. She supposedly they died when she was a child, but what one can see is that she's reached that stage in her development where the question of identity is a burning question for her, right? And so she's got these loving parents who have adopted her, but it's not enough, because she says, I want to know who I am, and who I am comes from who my parents were. So even when we begin to develop our own self-identity, we know that we are still deeply connected to someone who came before us, to the people who created us. That's what I'm saying, that interspace between my own identity, which is just me and I define, to the fact that I know my identity is defined through the social matrix of everything around me. And that is exactly the same on the national level. The national level, in terms of Judaism, I am born a Jew. I am deeply connected to everyone who is a Jew. I am connected to the history of what became before me, what comes in the future. That's who I am, of my laws, of my rituals, of my practice, of what makes me particular, of what gives me my national identity. And at the same time, I also know that I have to be in interaction with the rest of the world, that I am part of something that isn't just my national identity. But in order for me to retain my national identity, I need to create boundaries. And this is exactly where the idea of the inside and the out, which is at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, and the idea of national identity and individual identity all come together. And where does it come together? It comes together in the midbar, in the in-between space, in the boundary, in the space between two places, two fixed places. The in-between space is where we form our national identity. And now I want to read with you a brilliant book called The Nursing Father. Oh, I didn't write the name of the person who wrote the book. That's really not right of me. Oh my goodness, I can't remember the name. I have to bring it afterwards. Yeah.
Boundaries in general, we try to think of as static.
Yes.
And individuals, whether it's like Soloveitchik or it's
Greenberg, yeah.
Greenberg, who was in ashrams and
yes.
So every individual, like I can have a lot of respect, let's say, for an individual who sets their boundaries and defines themselves relative to others, and he or she needs more exposure to the other because it's all relative, and every individual has, or someone needs to close themselves off more because that helps them deal with their. So when you've got a gazillion individuals setting their boundaries in a very fluid way, how in heaven's name, there's no formula except a fluid one to get to national identity, because the nation of a bunch of people with fluid boundaries, which is by the way we're defining how we set our boundaries, it's not static, it's very fluid and it's relative. How does a national identity be formed, under what, and what holds it together?
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question for those on Zoom. I'm going to try and make it concise. Tell me if I've got it right. The question was, how, if each individual has fluid boundaries, and we're constantly reassessing our boundaries of how we create our self-identity and the individuality, how from that kind of makeup, that boundary creation, do we then form a national identity? If there's lots of different individuals, that's the question. That's exactly the question of Sefer Bamidbar. Did you want to add something?
I wanted to say, you have to have an event, a seminal event.
Okay, so
mass revelation.
100%.
And it completely changes our, not DNA, but soul, whatever. It creates a critical mass that reverberates through the millennia.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you what Gila said. I'm going to develop it. 1 minute. I'm going to just 1 second. I'm going to hit. I'm repeating. Yes.
Google says that the Nursing Fathers by Aaron Wildavsky.
Wildavsky, exactly. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. The book is by Aaron Wildavsky. Wildavsky. Yes, it's a funny. I know. Wildavsky. Okay. Well, Gila.
I wrote it on the chat as well.
I also looked it up.
Thank you. Thank you. Amazing. Oh, you put it on the chat. Thank you very much. Okay. What Gila said here, which I think is super important, is that in order to, as an answer, in order to form a national identity from many, many individuals, you need something that is going to bind them together. And Gila says for her, that binding together is mass revelation. I would say it's even more than mass revelation. I'm going to hear the second part in a minute. I would add to that a narrative. Yeah. A story, a narrative is very often the way, the method through which we can bring individuals, even if their boundaries are fluid or static, it doesn't matter, into something bigger than themselves, a narrative. Now, we can do it through social contract, like we spoke about social contract. We can do it through social covenant, or we can do it through covenantal politics, which Rabbi Sachs defines as narrative building. Narrative building, again, is mass revelation at Sinai. It's coming out of Egypt. Again, I said this to you at the beginning. Why does Moses again and again and again, as they're coming out of Egypt, all the time Moshe is turning around to the people of the tell the story. And I want to say something even more. Why is it that as they are about, and both now and in Sefer Yoshua, as they're about to enter the land and move the boundary, they have to do two things. One is Brit Milah, and the other is Pesach. Two things they have to do. Think about those two things and how they have created our national narrative thousands and thousands of years later. Today, Leil HaSeder, we tell the story. That's our narrative. That makes us, that forms our national identity. Brit Milah, we'll talk about it in a minute, but Brit Milah is also part of that, exactly that narrative. Did you want to add one
last thing? God bless our differences, personal and national, because it is in our differences that we have what to offer one
exactly
another.
100%. It's in our differences we'll have to offer one another, and that I think is the key. The key is the question. The biggest challenge is how we maintain our individual identities and how we're absorbed as individuals into the whole, but still maintaining the individual. And that's why I think Bamidbar offers us an answer. We said you're part of the whole, you're going out, you're fighting, you're part of this story, and yet we recognize that you have your own individual identities. You are to your families, to your thing, to your names. You each have a name, you each have a family, you are all the time surrounded by different circles of self-definition. I'm going to take one last question and we're going to move forward. Ronnie.
Just a comment about the shared narrative, the remembering. It's in our parsha, the whole story with Yid and Asher. It's to remember. It's a mark on you to remember. And this is before Matan Torah. So Brit Hamilah, the first of the three mitzvot. There's Puravu, which is universal. There's the Brit Milah, which is national. But there's also the Yid and Asher, which is a remembrance to. It's a shared experience. They remember. This is an external
100%. The idea of the Gita Nashe is the idea to remember that which we've forgotten.
But it's also to remember that you're going to have a mark on you. You will limp. You will be mukab. You will also
for sure. And I actually wrote about that last week. But yeah, 100%. We have marks, but those marks are also something that gives us our narrative and gives us our identity. I want to read source 16. Slavery and anarchy, because they're bound. Okay, so this is written by someone called Aaron Ulidovsky, and he develops the idea of Moshe as a political leader. It's an excellent book. It's a very old book, I think. Slavery and anarchy, because their boundaries are weak, are incompatible with membership and what afterward was appropriately called the Mosaic community. And here he's really touching on all the things we've been developing. And that is this idea of anarchy and order. Right? Chaos and order, and how boundaries are that which allow us to create order from chaos. And in order to create a Mosaic community, we have to impose some boundaries. Otherwise, there's no way of creating that community. Innumerable prescriptions are imposed on slaves because they lack defenses against external rule. Trying new things, converting risks into opportunities is the leitmotif of anarchies that encourage each individual or clan to transact with whomever it wishes. Jews may order themselves into hierarchies and equities, but making decisions collectively for the group as a whole, because these regimes have strong boundaries, but not into regimes that can make them vulnerable to outside influences. Jews must remain a community with strong boundaries so they can worship the one God. From this prohibition against idolatry, slaves worship masters and anarchists contract with whom they will, stems the Judaic abhorrence of mixing and Judaism's conceptual concern about keeping like categories together. By the way, even think about the idea of shutness. Okay, the idea of shutness is also the idea of not mixing categories. Okay, there's a lot of things in Judaism that create defined, the sacred and the profane, tumah and tahara, kashrut, many different things that create a separateness. And there is a very, very strong sense in Judaism of having to be an am kadosh, having to be an am nivchal, having to be not necessarily even chosen, but to be separate, because Judaism understood that separateness is what allows us to be God's nation. It allows us to continue to maintain God's message in the world. Again, those of you that are doing 929, all the time what we're seeing in Sefer Yoshua and Sefer Shoftim is that when the Jews don't maintain the boundaries and don't maintain the separateness and don't create both literally the boundaries of Am Yisrael, literally the boundaries of the land, there is always a threat to their mission. Now, again, we can ask the question, and this is really the question. How do we define the boundaries? When do we let things in? When do we let things out? And again, it goes back to the idea of the Hanukkah story, which I'm going to talk about at the end, since I'm not here on Monday for the Yom Yun. So I'll give you a little bit of Hanukkah now, okay? I'm going to continue. The plagues themselves make clear the principle of separation to disparate categories is not far from don't mix with the Midianites. Essence of Leviticus is found in the 10th verse of the 10th, and you may put difference between holy and unholy, clean and unclean. Equitable social laws are wed with fair measures, holiness with wholeness, for you shall keep unto the Lord that which is bruised or crushed or broken or cut. Israel is separated from others so it can be kept together in worship. As we are told, I shouldn't say jam. It's because I do it with an app, and sometimes the app goes a bit mad. Okay, whatever. Your Lord, your God, which you have separated you from other people. You shall therefore put difference between clean beasts and unclean, between unclean fowls and clean, and you shall not make your souls abominable. And you shall be holy unto me, for I am the Lord, I am holy. I have severed you from other people that you should be mine. Okay, this whole idea of kedusha, of Tumah and Tara is this idea of being separate. The injunction to differentiate the clean from the unclean is directly tied to the unity of the people, the differentiation of objects serving to me enforce the differences between other peoples. Why always separation of the pure from the impure? Death for both is the penalty for intercourse between man and daughter in his law, because they have wrought confusion. That's how Leviticus talks about it. What does it mean, confusion? Just as no man must covet his neighbor's wife, and no father-in-law take his daughter-in-law, no tribe must occupy the place allotted to another. Confusion of categories of that which may and may not be done spells the end of a common culture under which men are able to regulate their lives. In short, cultural confusion could turn Israelites into Egyptians. Social impurity leads to pollution of the land. The book of Genesis is a Mosaic teaching. Mosaic doctrines begins at the beginning. Like Israel, mankind is the first separated from other creatures. The first sentence of Genesis, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, sets up the most fundamental separation of all between God and man. The creator is not the created. A man can never cross that boundary to become God. And again, this sits exactly on the interspace that we were talking about. In the same way that we have national identity and individual identity, in the same way that we speak about the idea of the need for static boundaries and fluid boundaries, in the same way that we always say we take a bit from here and a bit from, we let some things in and don't let some things in. There are things we are like God. We are Tselem Elokim. In some ways, we are very much created in God's image. We are creators. We have language which is above animals. We are like God, we can recreate, we can make, we are free. And yet, we also have to know we are not like God. There is a boundary between us and God. If the children of Israel had any doubts about the mixing of people as well as categories, the law's instructions for entering their homelands should dispel them. The people are to drive out all the inhabitants, destroy all their pictures and molten images and high places, and divide the land among themselves. If they fail to do so, you which yet let shall remain shall be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides. altogether disagreeable. And if that were not enough, there is the discomfort of knowing that moreover it shall come to us that I shall do unto you as though I do unto you, as though I do unto them. Israel is being warned to leave Egypt morally as well as physically, lest it share the same fate. What Aaron Wodowski is saying here is exactly this idea, that there, especially when we first come into the land, and even more so when we are creating the boundaries of national identity. This is super important. When we are at the beginning point of creating the boundary of national identity, we have to be very careful with the boundaries of what's inside, what's outside, how we define things, how things are put into certain boundaries. Once we have created national identity, then it is easier to be fluid with boundaries. I always say like this. It's not an impossible situation. It requires a lot of self-introspection and a lot of, what's the word? A lot of the ability to interpret one's reality.
Even this philosophy, a person, let's say like me, would say, okay, this gives me justification for my fluid boundaries, and I want to explore this, and I want to explore that. And on the other hand, someone less likely, let's say, who lives in a
Close community.
can say, this is justification.
100%. I agree with you. That's human nature, and that is exactly why. That is exactly why we are created the way we are created. Because we are not all alike, and everyone will interpret their reality different and interpret the situation different. I'm going to give you an example. I'll give you an example. When we bring up children, this is like always the way I look at it. When we bring up children, we have to give them two gifts. The first gift is that when they are young, we have to give them a very boundary infused existence in which things are very black and white. This is wrong, this is right. This you do, this you don't do. This is what we do, that's what they do. Everything is very defined. And that's what a child needs. A child needs limitations and boundaries and definitions. And how do you teach a child things? You teach them through definitions. This is a book. This is the color yellow. This is. Once the child reaches a certain age, the next gift we have to give them is to disillusion those boundaries. Okay? Which is essentially to say to them, actually, the world is far more complex and nuanced than what we were taught you when you were younger. Now, if we don't disillusion them, they will. The likelihood is either they will remain almost childlike in the way they look at the world, or they will become fundamentalists. There's one of two things, right? And I think there's many meaning. Sometimes they do it on their own. Very often they will do it on their own, and that's what teenage rebellion is all about. It's about breaking the boundaries. It's about exploring my self-identity. It's about saying, hold on, everything my parents told me, it actually isn't true. What a parent's job is, by the way, I don't do this right myself, so I'm preaching, but it's definitely not something I've done on my, I would say successfully, necessarily. I try, everyone tries. What I think a parent's job is to allow them the space to explore boundary breaking, and yet at the same time remind them that boundaries are still important. So you're like disillusioning them, but at the same time you're telling them that identity is made up through boundaries, and yet those boundaries, exactly as you said, are fluid. Now, if we take that to the national level, okay, I would argue, this is my argument, this is my way of looking at it, you can agree or disagree. My argument is that throughout our history, the Jewish people have had moments whereby, especially when we went into the land and we were really still in a slave mentality, and we had to create those boundaries and things had to be defined because we were almost childlike in our cognitive state of childlikeness or childness. We had to have very strict boundaries. As we become an established nation and we have security, right? And we have grown up, so to speak, and we have our national identity, then there is an opportunity for those boundaries to become more fluid and for us to explore, because when the boundaries are so static, and this is what he begins to speak about, and we're going to develop this, when boundaries are so static and fixed, there is absolutely no room for creativity or growth. When is everyone with me? I feel like we're going very deep today. Okay. When it's always a danger in these classes. When so just let me finish this 1 second. So at the beginning, again, like a child, you need those very static boundaries. When we begin to grow up, when we've established our identity, exactly like a teenager, teenagers exactly in that desert. I always see the desert, the wilderness is that teenage stage where you're kind of not sure, you're in between. But once we've established, once we know who we are, once we understand that there are certain things that are fixed, then the boundaries can become more fluid. And then we can allow ourselves to explore and become creative and grow and take things from the inside and know what to leave out and know what to define and where to put our boundaries. That to me is the Hanukkah story. And that to me is the enlightenment story of enlightenment. The story of enlightenment is exactly this story. The Jews remained for many, many, many years in exile, where they had to, for the purpose of survival, create very high boundaries. What is inside and what is outside, what is pure and what is impure, what is allowed and what isn't. And then enlightenment happens. And all of a sudden, the Jewish people were exposed to all of these ideas in the same way in the Hanukkah story and the Greeks and everything, the whole culture that they were exposed to. And the Jews had to make decisions. In the Enlightenment period, there were two, but also in the Hanukkah story, it parallels very nicely. There were two basic responses. One was segregation. We are not taking anything from the outside. We are closing ranks and we are closing ourselves off. The other was integration. There was the further one, which was assimilation, but we're not even going to include that because that's totally not having anything. That's basically putting down all the boundaries. But integration was, to what degree do we integrate and take things? And what degree do we maintain our own identity? The Hanukkah story was the same. And why, by the way, the entire Hanukkah story is based on the idea of inside or outside. If you look at Al-Hanissim prayer is all about what? Why does the miracle happen in Al-Hanissim? Because of Al-Hanissim, and it talks about what? It talks about the war. The war, it was because we beat very much an external, we beat them with a war. In the Gemara in Shabbat, when it speaks about the miracle of Hanukkah, what does it talk about? The Kad HaShemen. Who saw the miracle of the Kad HaShemen? Only the Kohanim, only those people that were in the inner chamber of the Beit HaMikdash. They were the only, only to them. They were the only ones that saw it. And they're both polemics. Al-Hanissim prayer was the Hashmonaim. They said, we were the ones that created this miracle. It was all about, and the Hashmonaim, what was their polemic? Their polemic was integration. We are taking from the Greeks the idea of fighting and not just being passive. We are actors in history. We are going to go out, we're going to fight for what we believe in. They took a lot of the ideas from Greek culture. We are strong, we are mighty, we are warriors. That wasn't a Jewish idea before then, okay? And they took that idea and they said, this is what the miracle is all about. This is what Hanukkah is about. It's about integrating, it's about knowing what to take in and what to leave out. The rabbis, many years later, once the Hashmonaim dynasty had basically become totally secular and corrupted, the rabbis turned around and said, we don't want the legacy of the Hashmonaim. We want you to understand that what is only important in Judaism is what's on the inside, is not the integration with the outside, but segregating, closing ranks, and looking only in the holiness of the Beit HaMikdash. It's only about what is holy and not holy, what is pure and impure. And that's what the Hanukkah story is about. Again, it sits exactly on this very narrow bridge between how we define ourselves, how we define national identity, what we let in and what we let out. And I'm going to leave this as an open question. You'll probably guess where I stand on it, but I'll leave it as an open question. In our period today, okay, we have established our homeland. We have a strong national identity. Okay, we know who we are. We know what our history is. Should we, I'm asking a question, I'm opening it as a question. Shall we be allowing our boundaries to be fluid, or should we be putting up our boundaries and making them fixed? I'm going to leave it as an open question. We could be here till tomorrow arguing it out. Esther.
I don't remember if it's the last Parsha or the next one, when Yaakov, after the story of Shem,
yes,
and he tells the people he wants to go.
Is it just me or have we way past our time?
We're not.
Almost 10:45.
Oh no, what time do I finish? 10:30. I'm so confused. Sorry. Okay, sorry. I kept thinking we finished at 10 past. I don't know why. Yeah, go.
Hashem tells him to go to Bethel. Before they go, he tells them to remove all the idols and all the things, and he takes them and buries them. And only then he goes into Bethel. And it's putting a boundary.
Wow.
of the Avodah Zarah.
You're fair. You're right. There is that. It's such an interesting narrative, 100%. That he buries all the Yaakov, before they go into Shechem, he buries all the idols. Oh, it's after they've gone into Shechem, and he says, yeah, fair.
You know, because he's afraid that the other nations around him
Attack him.
So Hashem tells him, go to the day where you first promised.
From where you made the neder, the vow, and that was for Yaakov, that was the boundary. That's where the dream was. The dream is also, by the way, about boundaries. Where's God? Where's man? The ladder up and down. Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that, Esther. I want to, in the time we've got left, I want to look at source number 17, which I actually found on the 929 website. I think it's a really, by someone called Rabbi Avidan Freeman. I think he defines it so nicely. Here, he's specifically talking about the idea of the Nazir. And this is a further question. This is, well, we've spoken about inside and outside. We've spoken about boundaries. We've spoken about order and anarchy. We've spoken about how we create individuals into a society. We've spoken about social contract. We've spoken about covenantal contract. And here he asks another question. He asks the question of, even when you have to have boundaries, even when boundaries are an absolute necessity to create a community, what happens to someone on the fringes? What happens to someone who doesn't necessarily comply or is not necessarily conforming? What do we do to them? So this is how he asks, can our community tolerate fringes? How do we relate to those who live at the margins of society? The answer we seem to get from chapter 5 is harsh. You expel them, okay? Which is essentially what we're talking about, the people who are tum'ah, or the nazir, or the sotah, right? There's no room in the camp for the leper or for the defiled, not in our backyard. But chapter 6 begins to paint a more nuanced picture. The Nazirite too is a fringe character, a person who has decided that he can't partake of the pleasures in this world like everyone around him does. He or she acts differently, looks different. By the way, even just, I'm thinking about it now, even what the Nazir does, which is essentially the idea of total segregation, by the way. The Nazir is saying, I know I am a person, I feel that I am a person who, if I start opening up my boundaries, will go down a slippery slope. So what do? I close ranks. That's what the Nazir is saying. I'm not allowing myself to do anything. And the Torah doesn't look on that favorably. It says, no, we're not meant to totally close ranks and totally segregate ourselves from the world. We're meant to be living in the world. We have to be all the time in between these two things. There's something about the separation that the Torah does not completely endorse. There's an interesting commonality between the Nazirite and the fringe and the categories mentioned in the last chapter who are beyond the fringe. In all these cases, there's an intensive involvement on the part of the priest in order to bring them back to the norm. The fringes will always exist in every society, and so will those people who cross the line, who contaminate society, and who need a time out. All that is inevitable, and in some cases even necessary and desirable, although not ideal. So the question is not how to prevent people from reaching the margins or crossing lines. The really important question is, what pathways exist for them to return home at the right times? We might bemoan the proliferation of those who go off the derech, but what ways are offered for them to return? Our chapter suggests that this is precisely the job of the most elite of spiritual figures, the priest. The chapter mysteriously ends with the priestly blessings. You've got it in your sources at the beginning. And now we can understand why. The responsibility of the priest, the blessing he brings to people, especially by tending to the fringes and facilitating the return to the center, is the blessing of peace and the blessing of harmony. I think it's such a beautiful idea that in the end, if you look, the bracha of the priest comes right at the end of all these narratives of who's inside and outside. And ultimately, that is exactly the idea. If I go back to last week's Parsha, Yaakov, where he's coming Yaakov has a crisis of identity. Who am I? He was in the tent. He was totally segregated. He was a person who knew his identity. He knew he was Yaakov. He knew he was the Ishtam Yoshev Olim. And then he comes out the tent and he takes on elements of Esav and he lies and he cheats. And all of a sudden doesn't know who I am. And his whole identity has been absolutely disintegrated. And for many, many years when he's in the house of Lavan, he's trying to understand who he is. Who am I? And eventually, as he is about to go back over the boundary into Eretz Yisrael, he comes face to face with an Ish. Who is this Ish? So Chazal say it's a Malach, but an Ish could equally be his own self. He comes face to face almost with the other part of self, which he's been trying to repress for all those years. And he says to him, Mashemcha, the Ish says, what's your name? And he says, Yaakov. I want to go back to being Yaakov. I want to be Yaakov. I want one identity that's segregated and not messed up and not nuanced. I want to be Yaakov. And the Ish says to him, Lo od shimcha Yaakov ele Yisrael. Your name is no longer going to be Yaakov. You are now Yisrael. Ki sarita im Elohim ve'im anashim v'tuchal. Because your destiny is to struggle. Your destiny is not to have one chalak, because he is chalak, right? One chalak identity, one simple identity, but to be entangled like Esav, to be entangled and to all the time be going back and forth. That is identity development. And by the way, the beautiful thing there, which exactly speaks, parallels what goes on here. At the end of all of this, the priests, the elite, right, are the ones who go down. The elite, by the way, we know even with the red heifer, the paraduma, the priests are the ones that have to make themselves impure to purify. Even the elite have to cross the boundaries. Even the elite can't remain up there in the ivory tower. Part of our Jewish identity is that there's always, even though we need the boundaries, we recognize that there is always a fluidity in those boundaries. And sometimes we have to surpass those boundaries in order to get to the end goal. And that's what the priest is. And ultimately, the priest is the one that gives us the bracha. He's the one that gives us the blessing. Before Yaakov leaves the Ish, he turns around to him and he says to him, let me go. The Ish says, let me go. And Yaakov says, I am not going to let you go until you bless me, until you give me a bracha. And that is ultimately the idea here. The idea here is, how are we a blessing both to ourselves, our own identity, and also to those that may not be part of our identity. I'll just leave you with one final story. I think I may have even said it already in this class. We were in America over the summer. We went to San Francisco, and in San Francisco, those of you that have been there recently, it's become a city absolutely proliferated with homeless people. They're everywhere you go, and it's honestly, it's not very pleasant. And all the time you've got police arresting people, and you've got needles all over. It's mamash not a pleasant place to be. And while we were there, we went to Alcatraz. And the most interesting thing about Alcatraz that I found was the fact that there was a massive debate going on. Even as you go round, you see it, because the commentary that they speak about is this idea that originally Alcatraz was formed as a place where you put the people who were on the fringes of society and you did not want them to be part of society. And it was a very physical, literal thing. You could see the islands offshore. They were taken by boat, and there was no way for them to get back. You know, one of the most famous films is Escape from Alcatraz. There's no way of escaping, right? They were put there, they would remain there for their whole lives. They didn't ever go back into society. Over the years, specifically in San Francisco, they realized that this wasn't fair, meaning it wasn't what they ideally wanted. They wanted a way in which those people would be able to integrate nicely back into society. So they tried to find a way to bring the prisoners back and integrate them into society. Ultimately, again, that didn't 100% work. And now, this is what I felt anyway. I felt that they, in a postmodern world, they carried such a heavy burden that they felt so guilty about that idea of Alcatraz, which still sits there today, that we wanted to put them outside, and we wanted that today. The law in San Francisco is that the homeless are allowed to live on the streets, and that is in a sense their tikkun for what they did. But again, it's also not an ideal reality. Right? It's only my interpretation of it. I might be wrong, I might be right. I don't know, right? I think there's a subconscious thing there. And again, but what the Torah offers us here is so profound. It says to us that there are people on the fringes of society, and sometimes, in some cases, they're going to have to go outside for a period of time. And sometimes, in some cases, they may not come back in. But when they do come back in, and even when they don't, there's always an idea of the blessing that overrides everything. So with that, we're going to finish. And next week is Hanukkah. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to come back and talk about the final theme, which is Pesach and Brit Milah. And then, please God, we're going to move on to chapter 11, which is one of my favorite chapters in Sefer Bamidbar. Okay, see you all then. Have a great break.
That's my nice idea that you're a Ben Torah because you're a son. You can never leave your parents. I mean, you're born into a family, but you're a Baal Averot. Because a Baal and your wife can't get divorced, so it's not to be permanent. You just need to do tzivah or be able to do tikkun.
Yeah, there's so many examples.
Look at this, it's so pretty.
בסדר, מחכה לשמוע ממך
And you know what else is sad? It's a very difficult question.